welcome Brent Forrester.
Thanks, guys. Okay, so welcome to Brent Forrester TV Writing Stories, Part 2. In Part 1, I walked you through breaking in, which I know is a massive obsession for all who aspire to work in TV or the film industry as writers. Gave you a few lessons from Susan Harris, whose advice remains fundamental to me about writing what's difficult for you, even painful, and trusting it will come out funny. Talked a little bit about sketch structure and the Ben Stiller show, and then I shared with you, who were here, all of my joke writing secrets that I used on The Simpsons, where I worked for several years. Tonight, I want to do a little Simpsons Part 2, because as writers of comedy, really, there are two distinct skill sets that we bring. One of them is dialogue writing, and in that subset we have joke writing. And the other part of writing half-hour comedy is stories and storytelling. And so I think it's worth dwelling on what I was able to pick up about story structure at The Simpsons. So we'll start there, and then I will walk you into another period of TV writing for me, which was writing on King of the Hill. And again, tremendous story lessons there. Also lessons about how to set up a show beautifully so that it runs for a very long time. And then we'll wrap up by talking a little bit about some experiences I had writing feature film scripts. I have had a tremendously lucky run of writing and rewriting feature-length screenplays. I've done 25, 30 of them. And I'll give you a few highlight stories from there, stories of success and kind of epic catastrophe. So you have that to look forward to. All right, let's start with The Simpsons. So The Simpsons is a classic TV show for a couple of reasons. One of them for sure is the tremendous talent of that writing staff in the early seasons. George Meyer, John Swartzwelder, Mike Reiss, Al Jean, the list goes on and on of Mount Rushmore level writers. But in addition to that and the incredibly inventive visual style that Matt Groening contributed, there was another key element, and that key element was Jim Brooks. Remember that this show was created by Matt Groening, the writers, and Jim Brooks. Jim Brooks remains the guy that all the people that I look up to in TV look up to. He was the guy who created the Mary Tyler Moore Show. He did Taxi. He directed and wrote Terms of Endearment. What's the common denominator there? It's mature, funny writing that is emotional. And we forget that The Simpsons, though an animated show and one that when you think back on it, you remember the zaniest, craziest stuff that they do on that show. The core of it was really emotional, especially in the early seasons. If you look at it, in the first 3 seasons, The Simpsons, one member or another of The Simpsons cries in almost every other episode, which is so odd for an animated show, isn't it? The show had a very grounded quality emotionally, and it's part of why it was and has been successful for so many years. Jim Brooks was and is considered a sort of master storyteller in the half-hour medium. And The Simpsons, when I was there, the way the show would run, we would have what was called a story conference at the beginning of every year. And the story conference was just nerve-wracking. It was, and I presume still is, a 2-day retreat in one sort of giant suite at Shutter's Hotel. So they would just use the Simpsons money to rent out a really big suite, and there would be, lots of snacks and stuff. And then the writers, every single writer on the show, would have to go in turn and pitch a Simpsons story. But these pitches were phenomenally detailed, much more than I've ever experienced in television before or since. You were expected to say, fade in, here's the opening set piece, here's what happens, here's jokes, full of jokes, act breaks, and an ending. it was a 15-minute performance at least in front of Jim Brooks. And it was the only time you ever saw him during the year was during those story conferences where he would sit with his beard and listen. And if you laughed, you were ecstatic. If you liked your thing, all the writers would envy you and congratulate you. And if you bombed, it was the worst thing ever. So into that environment, I entered as a novice writer. I, at this point, only worked on one failed multicam show, Nurses, and a sketch show. And I really did not know what I was doing. But, and this is the lesson that you'll get from me over and over again, I learned how to do it just by watching other people do it and trying to analyze a bit of storytelling, and learned how to do it, as anyone here can do. I want to walk you through the most successful of the stories that I pitched and then wrote for The Simpsons, because I think it's instructive for us to look at what made this a successful story. So when I was at The Simpsons, I wrote 3 episodes. One was called Homer versus Patty and Selma, one was Homer Palooza, and one was called Lemon of Troy. This was in season 6. Some of you may have seen it. If not, let me try to tell you the story. And you'll note that just in this kind of oral tradition of telling the story, you'll be able to sort of track the way the episode goes when animated. It's worth dwelling on because one of the principles that I apply as a showrunner always in generating stories for the season we're doing is start by having the writer tell the story. All right, so let's see if I can tell the story of Lemon of Troy, largely the way I pitched it to Jim Brooks. All right, we start with a kind of an opening animated set piece. At this time on The Simpsons, we would generally have a kind of elongated comedy set piece that would launch the story. So the set piece in this case is Bart comes upon wet cement and decides to write his name in the wet cement. And there's a kind of a fantasy sequence as he imagines what future generations will make of seeing Bart written in cement and who they thought he was. He writes his name in wet cement, but he gets caught, and they bring him home, and Marge is very upset with him. She says, this is your hometown. You know, how could you vandalize this? A town is a thing to be proud of. And so Bart is thinking about this. He's got Marge's words ringing in his ears, and he goes out and he sort of walks through Springfield. And he sees, you know, this town is kind of great. Look at this. We've got a little minor league baseball team here, the Springfield Isotopes. You get kind of a joke off the isotopes, right? Mm-hmm. And we've got a watering hole, a fishing hole, where kids catch fish. This is a wonderful hometown. We get a joke off the kids catching the fish. But you know, best of all, we've got this lemon tree. This lemon tree right on the border of our hometown, Springfield, and Shelbyville, the town next door. And this lemon tree is where the kids get their lemons and they make lemonade, and it's part of the whole economy of being a kid in this town. But the tree itself is right there on the border between Springfield and Shelbyville. In fact, it grows right on the border, and lemons fall into Springfield and they also fall into Shelbyville. And so the kids from Shelbyville, the rival town, also come there, and we get a scene where Bart is there and he's got the lemons with his guys, and the Shelbyville guys come up on the other side, and they have a conflict. And they yell at each other, because, oh, we hate you from Shelbyville. And the Shelbyville guys say, we hate you from Springfield. And they throw lemons at each other, and they have a big argument. And the next day, Bart and his friends wake up, and oh my God, the lemon tree is gone. And there's tracks leading into Shelbyville. So Bart and his buddies decide, you know, we got to get this back. We're going to go into enemy territory. We're going to get this lemon tree back. So we get a set piece now where all the kids are getting their kind of gear that they like to get. The Millhouse has his camouflage gear, and he imagines using it to disappear entirely from sight. And all the guys have their binoculars and their gear that kids have, and they go into Shelbyville looking for the lemon tree. Meanwhile, the dads of the kids in Springfield find out the kids are missing, and they go off, we got to find these kids, oh my God, they've gone into Shelbyville, and the lemon tree has been stolen. The lemon tree, and we get a backstory, historical flashback of the origin of this lemon tree, which was planted when the two towns were founded and the original rivalry between the two towns began. Okay, the dads go off searching for the kids in their RV. A tremendous amount, by the way, happens in this episode. I watched it the other day, and the amount of story that we used to pack in there still astonishes me relative to what we do now. For example, on Love, the single-camera Judd Apatow show, or even The Office, which was a pretty story-dense show. In this episode, a number of things happen. Bart infiltrates the Shelbyville kids and is caught The Shelbyville kids make him try to paint a big sign on a cliff that says Springfield sucks, but instead he writes Springfield rules, suckers. He escapes in an action set piece on a skateboard. He ends up in the Springfield Zoo, and it says in Roman numerals, all the doors are marked off, and there's a tiger behind one, but he hadn't studied Roman numerals early in the episode, and there's a set piece there. There's also tracked little mini arcs between characters. Nelson and Martin, the bully and the nerd, team up. Milhouse discovers there's another Milhouse in the town and bonds with the guy there. So there's admirable structural things happening. The mini arcs of the B-story characters I thought were impressive upon watching it again, and the amount of action and event that happens. But what really distinguished the episode was the ending. So just watch how this thing ends. So the dads finally catch up with the kids in the RV, in Flanders RV. Dads and kids unite. By this time, the dads, remembering their old antagonism towards Shelbyville, are just as mad as the kids are that their precious lemon tree has been stolen. And where's the lemon tree? Well, it's been stolen by the meanest kid in town, whose dad is the meanest dad in town. He runs a tow truck yard. And that's where the lemon tree is. It's inside the tow truck yard, which is ringed with barbed wire. It's really like a kind of fortress of suburbia. There's no way to get in. And so the Springfield dads and the kids are outside shaking their fists, give us our lemon tree, but they can't get it. And so they reach complete and total defeat. And they walk away. I guess sometimes you just can't win. And the twist is that Bart convinces them to park the RV in a red zone, and the RV gets towed into the tow truck lot, and then over cover of darkness, the Springfield dads and kids creep out, grab the lemon tree, put it in the truck, and then off they go. And so it's the old Trojan horse done in Springfield Shelbyville terms, and that was the episode. Okay, so this was considered very successful as a story. It was certainly the most well-received episode that I ever did. The things that are worth identifying, I think, why was this a strong episode? All right, here are the lessons for you when you're writing your half hours. Elements that made this strong. One is it has a strong, clear drive, all right? The kids are trying to get a lemon tree that we've loaded with stakes from the very beginning. It's a symbol of pride in one's hometown. It has a whole backstory as the origin of the conflict between the towns. So it's a concrete goal with a lot of stakes. You don't have to do much better than that when telling a story. It will always go well if you have a concrete goal and high stakes. In addition, there was a certain emotional element that probably saved the episode, because the stakes at this point are a little abstract and symbolic. But as soon as it was kids and dads trying to get their kids and worried about their kids, it had a sort of emotional element that probably is what redeemed the episode and made it more than just purely kind of intellectual. As I mentioned, there was mini arcs with the sub-characters. There was a lot of set pieces. And then it had an ending which was a twist. And almost always when you say that was an A-plus piece of entertainment, it had a great ending. It's sad to say because actually the vast majority of half-hour TV that we do does not have a great ending, does not have a surprise ending or a twist that you couldn't anticipate. But if you do ever hit that, it's disproportionately useful to people's impression of what you've done. So never discount the great ending. All right, that was Lemon of Troy, which, as I say, Jim Brooks was there for the table read of. He was there for the pitch of it. We did a table read of it. He was there for the table read, which went well. And then the episode went on to be shot. Interesting side note, and there's probably a dark lesson here as well. This was a couple of years into my time at The Simpsons. I had a 4-year contract. After 2 years, did Lemon of Troy, I'd done 3 episodes. I decided that I wanted to leave The Simpsons. I was like, I think I've learned enough here. I'm working very long hours. We used to work 10 a.m. till 10 p.m. So I said I'd like to leave. I told my agent, Jay Suris at UTA, who was a young guy like me at the time, in his 20s. He said, sure, yeah, whatever. I'll tell the guys at The Simpsons that you want to leave. I thought that it was taken care of, just from that. It totally wasn't. I left the show under contract. The 20th Century Fox lawyers contacted me threatening to sue. They made me meet Jim Brooks in his office, and I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, I understand that you're on strike. I didn't even understand what that meant. I was like, I just don't want to work there anymore. And he said, you wrote one of the best scripts we've ever read at table. It was a highlight of my career. And then he said, but now you're refusing to work. And I said, no, it's not that. I just figured you wouldn't want me there if I didn't want to be there. And he went fucking ballistic. He said, don't go down that path. And then he said a phrase I've never heard before since. He said, don't float that balloon. What does that mean? I do not know. Angry Jim Brooks with beard shaking is what I experienced there. But amazingly, I managed to stay out of my contract and go into another period of career. Keep in mind, when I started writing television, not that long ago, but in the late 90s, the fantasy forever for TV writers had been to get into movies. That was the fantasies. Oh God, we got to be here every day, working all day, writing TV. We want to get into movies where you can work at home and it seemed more glamorous. And so I retained that prejudice. I've completely lost that prejudice now. I would much rather be in TV than in film. But at the time, that represented a kind of fantasy progression. So when I left The Simpsons, I went and had a series of feature rewrites. This is part one of what I want to tell you about feature rewrites. Part one for me was encountering how weird and kind of oddly substandard the process was in the movie business relative to the way we were doing television. So the first feature rewrite gig I had was a script called Spies and Innkeepers. Ben Stiller, who I'd worked with on the Ben Stiller Show, had this idea he wanted to do a comedy set in Revolutionary War time. And so he liked me as a writer and got me hired to do the rewrites. So often that's how you get hired as a feature rewriter, is an actor has clout and kind of likes you and you get a job. That was nice, but I found that we were never getting anywhere close to the standard of quality that we had at The Simpsons, and yet no one seemed to be aware of it, which was unsettling to me. The next one I had was called a feature rewrite for a movie called Cousin Eddie, which was meant to be a sequel to the vacation movies, focusing on a character called Cousin Eddie, who was played by Randy Quaid. So I was doing a rewrite of this thing, a script for a movie that never got made. And here, I noticed another weird thing. There was a producer, Matty Simmons, who was one of the original producers of the National Lampoon magazines that owned Vacation, but wasn't himself a writer of any kind. And he was just living kind of a fantasy of being a comedy writer, and using me to execute his kind of ideas of what he thought were funny. And I found it was just easier to do what he said than to try to bring it up to quality, which is another kind of chilling lesson to have, but was a true compromise that I felt I had to make on that one. The third one, which was also kind of dark and bizarre for me, was a feature assignment of a movie that got made called The Stupids, which was directed by John Landis, an excellent director, a funny guy. Complete bomb, this movie. I mean, there was a time when The Stupids, starring Tom Arnold, by the way, as the star, the time when it was the biggest money-losing movie of all time. If you calculate how much money went into it and how much it made, it was like a $40 million movie that made $200,000. It's amazing. There was a studio called Pathé, which kind of collapsed in the making of it. I think we may have sunk Pathé with this horrible movie. And why was it so horrible? I mean, I went after it, trying my best to write the script, and they shot what I wrote. So it's kind of on me, this one, and Landis. I think the lesson here, Landis was, at that time, he was, involved in a difficult lawsuit, to say the least, with the Twilight Zone movies. He was in a very reactive, defensive, frightened place, and he was trying to just get contracts to direct movies and direct them and get paid. And that was really his whole motive. He had to get this off his plate in order to direct another one. And so he just said, write something, this is good, let's film it. And we just made this film. Why does it work so poorly? Because the whole thing is just a series of misunderstandings amongst these cartoony characters. The reason that movie is such a bad movie, it's not offensive, it's that there's no character. And I didn't even understand that at the time. It's only now that I can look at it and go, oh, you have to have character to get through a movie. You can't just name somebody and have them be dumb and go around, misunderstanding things. That just doesn't work. You have to build on character. You guys probably already know that, but I did not know that at the time. Interesting to note, isn't it, that I could have written a script which Jim Brooks would say, best we ever read at table. Maybe he was exaggerating, but I must have done well. And then do so poorly with the stupids. It goes to show a huge number of TV writers, myself included, where we really excel is writing other people's shows for other people's characters that have already been created. But when it comes time to create characters ourselves, we know very little. Something I was talking to you guys about last time, for me, even now, trying to figure out what makes a good character, trying to figure out how you create a good character is a total growth area for me. And if you can start trying to figure that out now, you will have an enormous advantage as writers throughout your careers. So, a few chilling experiences in feature rewriting. Then I get a call from a guy I had known at The Simpsons. His name was Greg Daniels. He said to me, I have created a new animated show called King of the Hill. I wonder if you would come on and be my number 2 there. Very flattering. Greg clearly thought a lot of me. And for me at this point, having had a year and a half or 2 in the unsettling world of features, I jumped at the chance to return to the sanity of TV in production. So I said yes to Greg. So let's talk a moment about King of the Hill, because I think that this show is incredibly well done at its best and is really unique for some very specific reasons. The 2 big ones are Greg Daniels and Mike Judge. So Greg I've talked about before. Greg was a guy that I had written with on The Simpsons who was an extraordinary writer. Greg's strengths, one is pure brain power. Later when he would create The Office, and I worked with him there, he was a guy who could walk in on a Tuesday, not having been there since the previous Thursday, say, guys, I was thinking about episode 4, and if you remember back in the second draft on about page 12, there was a paragraph that I think would work pretty good in episode 6, and we wouldn't even remember what episode 4 was. How he has the ability to do that is remarkable. It's not the only thing that made him great, though. Greg was just a funny, talented guy. He was Conan O'Brien's writing partner coming out of college. And Greg had a certain sensibility, which you can see in King of the Hill and you see more in The Office. The sensibility was for small, realistic, observational comedy. So you heard me pitch Lemon of Troy. Greg said to me, after Lemon of Troy table read, a compliment, but one that had a certain edge to it. He said, good table read, so you like those kind of epic stories, huh? And I said, yeah, I do. And he goes, yeah, cool. A classic Greg story, in some ways superior, was Bart Sells His Soul. If you ever saw that episode, and it's a great episode, it's based on something that really happened to Greg in college. A friend of his was goofing around. They were talking about whether the soul exists, and one guy said it does, another guy said he didn't, and the guy who didn't believe in the soul sold his soul, wrote it on a piece of paper and sold it for $5 and made fun of this guy who believes in an afterlife, and then became very worried. What if he had sold his soul? And it's just a funny, true observational story that Greg spun a full Bart episode out of. And there's a clue to Greg's sensibility there. Look how small and realistic it started. Look how it started in a real observation of humanity. That sensibility is very important to have respect for, because the people that very possibly you will most end up respecting in comedy, Jim Brooks, Greg Daniels, Judd Apatow, Paul Feig, and all the women comedians that he's corralling, the great comedy writers frequently have that as a preference and prejudice. Naturalism, realism. Okay? The other guy in the equation of King of the Hill, Mike Judge. So Mike Judge, it's so important to understand what a remarkable and strange savant Mike Judge probably is. He fools you because he's a guy from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who is kind of laid-back looking. When he talks, he sort of talks like this. He doesn't move his mouth very much, but it was very interesting to speak to you today. That's Mike for you. Mike was a guy without a ton of privilege. His mom was a Spanish teacher. His dad was, I think, an archaeologist or something. He went to public school in Albuquerque. And his parents really were worried for him economically and pushed him into engineering. If you watch Office Space, it's really about how much he hated being an engineer. But Mike knew that he was destined for something more, and after one of his early jobs, I think as a teenager, he had set aside some money, and he said, I'm either going to buy a camera and try to learn how to animate, or maybe I can buy a bass and learn how to play a bass. And he thought, well, I'll do the bass because it seems like girls like guys who are in bands. And so he took up the bass instead of the cartooning. This is how talented Mike is as a human being. He became the bassist for Doyle Bramhall's band. Doyle Bramhall is a legend in the history of blues. Doyle Bramhall has a song on every one of Stevie Ray Vaughan's albums. Mike was his bassist. That's how good he was as a bassist. But the other thing that Mike was really good at was doodling and cartooning. The essence, one of the essential elements of any animated show is the design of it. If you look at The Simpsons, it has a very specific design. The characters all have this overbite, they have these kind of goggly eyes. You cannot do a Simpsons-looking show without thinking about The Simpsons. And so to have your own distinct style is very rare. Very few talented animators can ever develop their own distinct style. Mike developed one on his own. When you see a Mike Judge drawing, you always know it's a Mike Judge drawing. It's a phenomenal talent he has as an illustrator. And this style, which is very real, much more real than The Simpsons, and a kind of a love of marginal characters. And so if you look at the designs of King of the Hill, that's really what you're seeing. So Mike's sensibility combined with Greg's to create that show. Mike had started with a central character. Okay, so now let's take a look at why is King of the Hill so well constructed. Here are the elements. If you're ever creating a show on your own, first thing you need, and you may need nothing more than this, but you definitely need this one thing first: central character. It's not a premise. In TV, the central thing is not the clever premise. 24, that's a clever premise. What if we just do the whole episode? Every episode is in real time, and the whole season is 24 hours. That's a premise, not the essence. The essence is character. Even with that premise, 24 would be a failure if the central character wasn't great to watch. King of the Hill starts with a central character. It is Hank Hill, an original character for TV. The character is a conservative. He's a Southerner. He's very proud of his country and his family and his life. Mike described him as a guy who wished society had stopped progressing around 1950. That's the key to the character, and that is his struggle. Look how well the other characters are designed to cause the central character to react. First and foremost is his son, Bobby. So Bobby is the embodiment of all these characters which will frustrate Hank. He's not good at sports. He's not macho. He's a little bit effeminate. He's kind of sensitive. Everything is designed to make life difficult for Hank in his kid. His wife, pretty well designed too, I think. She is a kind of a hybrid, very loyal to Hank, conservative like him, but passionately defensive of Bobby, and so can complicate his Bobby stories, and also open to change in the culture, which can be threatening to him. Then you have a kind of Greek chorus of his friends, Bill, Dale, and Boomhauer. They're just a Greek chorus. They're really there just mostly to comment and kind of stand together throughout the episodes. That, by the way, is what Mike had when he came to Greg. Greg, who was hired to help him develop the show, added some characters, also all deliberately designed to react to Hank's character. Greg added Luann, which was a niece. The key to Luann is her sexuality. She's just sort of always in shorts and a tank top that's really short, and this is threatening to Hank and makes him uncomfortable. The other character is his father, and the father was designed to be another degree of ultra-conservative over Hank. So you see Bobby is here, Hank is here, and the dad is one generation more in the direction of Hank. That construction made it really easy to do stories in a way that I've not experienced really on any other TV show. My job in season 2, when Greg hired me on, was to lead the writers. And so the principle I would apply, one that if you saw Brent Forrester TV Writing Stories Part 1, you'll know I picked up from the sitcom writers in my first job. A guy named Bruce Ferber taught me this. He said, most stories are about two people. And so on King of the Hill, over and over again, I would just say, okay, we did a Hank Bobby last time, let's do a Hank Luann story, maybe a Bobby Peggy story. And that's really how we would construct it. An A and a B story alternating conflicts between characters. We haven't done a Hank Bobby in a while. We can do one now in in episode 7, and that's really the way we would pace out the season. All right, so let's look at one King of the Hill story, which I would try to tell you, and see if we can identify what works about this story. I thought this was a very nicely constructed story from season 2. It's called Husky Bobby. All right, the episode begins with Hank and his wife Peggy and their 10-year-old son Bobby shopping for clothes. Now Bobby's a little bit chubby. They're in the department store trying to buy clothes, and unfortunately the clothes aren't fitting him real well. The regular sizes aren't quite fitting him. And the proprietor of the store comes up to Hank and Peggy and says, "Excuse me if I may, possibly your son should be shopping in a different store, one with sizes that are a little more realistic for him. There's a store called H. Dumpty's that might be right for him." And Hank and Peggy have this horrified moment of realizing, oh my God, our son's got to get his clothes in the fat kid store. We can't tell him. We'll take him there. We'll try to shop with him, but don't let him know. It'll just be heartbreaking for him. They bring him there. The clothes seem to fit, but then he's looking around and he realizes there are only fat kids here. This is a fat kid store, and he's heartbroken. And he cries, and they hug him, and they cry. And then Hank steps in, and he bucks Bobby up, and he says, "Son, don't be ashamed of yourself. You're a hill. You should be proud, and you're a handsome kid, the handsomest kid I ever saw." And Bobby says, "Thanks, Dad." He's very moved by his dad's words, and he starts trying on the clothes with great panache and flair, and suddenly he's very proud of himself. And the owner, Hal Dumpty, owner of H. Dumpty's, sees Bobby and says, "Mr. Hill, your son looks so great in my clothes. I'd love to photograph him for my catalog and make him a catalog model." Hank is horrified. The idea of his son modeling bothers him at the core. He whisks Bobby out. "No, I'm afraid we can't. I've got to think. We would, I'm sure. I don't want to shame my son here, but we're very busy and we can't drive him tomorrow, so this can't happen," etc., and whisks him out. Now we have one tricky misunderstanding. Okay, Bobby's at home on the weekend. He says he's bragging to his cousin Luann about how they want to shoot him for a catalog, but his dad's too busy to drive him. Luann says, "I'm not too busy. I'd love to style your hair." She takes him. He gets photographed for the catalog. By the time Hank figures out what's happened, the catalog is already, the ad is already in the local paper, and the paper is getting delivered to all the houses in the block. There's a good visual set piece of Hank running from house to house trying to take the ads out before his neighbors see. I think that beat was stolen, by the way, from a movie called Absence of Malice, if anyone's ever seen it. It's a woman, a Catholic woman whose secret abortion comes out, and then it's in the paper, and in this tragic scene she's trying to collect all the papers. So we just stole that for Hank. Then there are really two more set pieces. One is Bobby does a modeling shoot, and Hank tries to suck it up and watch this and not react. And then finally, Bobby wants to be in a contest, plus-size models big fashion show in the center of town. And Hank forbids it. He says, "You'll embarrass yourself. I can't allow it." But Bobby wants to go so badly that he sneaks out and goes to the show. Hank goes and tries to stop him. And this is where you really see a very Greg Daniels moment. So Greg Daniels had a high priority on unpredictable, unusual, genre-breaking endings. He really did not want you to know what the ending was going to be. It's very difficult to do that kind of ending. You really rack your brain trying to think of a new original ending. But watch what Greg did on this ending. Hank goes to the show. He's going to stop Bobby from modeling. Normally, where this story would go is Hank would be there, Bobby would come out on stage, Hank would want to stop him, he would see his son, and he would be overcome with a kind of acceptance. And Hank would change and realize, "You know what, maybe I don't know so much about things. You're right, Bobby. You know, people are different, and you can all be great in different ways." That would be the sitcom ending. Instead, what happens is Hank comes there, picks Bobby up, puts him over his shoulder and says, "I'm sorry, son, you're not doing this," and just walks out with him, and Bobby's kicking and screaming. Meanwhile, a bunch of jerky teenage kids have kind of infiltrated the show and found the donut table, and as the other kids all take the stage, the bad kids just huck jelly donuts at the fat kids, and it becomes this kind of, action movie of a splatter film of jelly donuts bursting on fat kids. And the ending, the happy ending, is Bobby going, "Oh, thanks, Dad, you were right. You really spared me from embarrassment." I guess I don't know as much as I thought. So, in that story, you have a lot of strong elements. In particular, I think that ending, but look at the other elements going into this, because they're not so many, but they're sufficient to make you feel like this is a solid episode, maybe the best of that season. The solid elements are opening set piece. We start in a really good set piece that you could do live action, you can do it animated. It's two parents finding out a secret that their kid doesn't know that's going to hurt his feelings and trying to protect him from it. You know, it feels high stakes in an emotional way. You can totally relate to it, and it's strung out for a little while. The parents find out, they don't want to tell him, they ride in the car, they're trying not to let him know the truth, they're in the store, they're still trying to keep it from him. Very Greg Daniels to play out that tension for 3 scenes before breaking it. And it's emotional. That's the key. Even in animation, you really feel a little misty-eyed, you know, when the poor kid finds out and the parents are heartbroken. Really strong way to open. The other element that's super strong is very strong characters in conflict with strong goals. Another element all you guys know from your studies, but look how well it works here. Bobby, who doesn't have a lot of things going on for him, he doesn't have a lot of sources of self-esteem, suddenly can be a star. Hank is horrified and must stop Bobby from becoming a plus-size model. So the antagonistic forces just set you up for a great drama the whole way through. Then in addition, it just has enough set pieces, enough event to get you from fade in to fade out. The opening set piece at H. Dumpty's, Hank trying to stop the newspapers from being delivered, a fashion shoot, and then a fashion show at the end. And that's really all you need to get through a half-hour episode of TV. It's a perfect example of good construction in TV. So that is a little primer in the way TV writers are thinking about story and kind of the elements that make for a good story at half hour. I did King of the Hill for 1 year. I found it tiring and high pressure, and at the end of it, I went back into the fantasy of doing feature rewrites, and I did a few more. So let me conclude with a few feature rewrite stories, some good, some bad. All right, coming out of King of the Hill, I actually found that I had picked up enough skills. Probably it was that Malcolm Gladwell thing of just doing it for enough hours. But I found that the feature rewrites, I was much more confident and much more successful in getting them and doing them. So here are a few tricks that I picked up. I found that when trying to get a feature rewrite, there was a moment where they would bring you in and you would pitch. And for me, always, I would know the project I was pitching on, and I would look at other successful movies in that genre and try to analyze what were the elements in those successes that I can claim I'm going to apply to this project. So for example, Iron Giant. This is an animated show for Warner Brothers, directed by Brad Bird. I did the last pass of that before it was greenlit, and how did I get the feature rewrite? I walked in and I said, this movie, Iron Giant, it's about a kid who discovers a giant from outer space, a sort of a giant robot that seems to be menacing but then becomes his ally. So I said, this is in the genre of kid and magical creature movies. So others in this genre would be E.T., a kid and a magical creature from space. Terminator 2, is it? The one where the kid and Schwarzenegger team up? Terminator 2, which was a hit about the time I was pitching this, is essentially kid and magical creature, as is Free Willy, which was like on the poster when I walked into Warner Brothers, and they were very proud of kid and magical creature. And that frequently was sufficient to get me the job, was that minimal amount of analysis and comparison. Certainly that's how I got Iron Giant. Another way I got a job, I did a feature rewrite pass of the movie Liar Liar starring Jim Carrey. All right, so here's another way to get a job. Why would I get this job? A giant feature. Jim Carrey was the biggest actor in the world at this time. This was in his $20 million feature period when no one had ever been paid that. Why would I get this job? All right, here's how it went down. I had known Judd Apatow from the Ben Stiller Show. Judd Apatow was a friend of Jim Carrey who had performed with Jim on stage when they were both coming up in the clubs and had written jokes for Jim for years. Whenever Jim did anything, a talk show performance, for example, he would call Judd and say, Judd, come over, if you got any funny friends, come over, let's write some jokes for me, let's work on some jokes. So I get this call from Apatow one night. He's like, we're going over to Jim Carrey's house, me and you and I got this other guy, we're going to write jokes for Jim. I go, what's it for? oh, he's doing an AFI tribute to Clint Eastwood, and he wants a few jokes for this. I go, cool, cool, all right. So what I did was, I wrote down a bunch of jokes beforehand that I thought might apply, and then when I got there and we're trying to kind of riff, I pretended that I was coming up with the jokes on the spot, which is nothing new. Jim Carrey's done that a million times, I'm sure, in his career as a comedian. It's kind of a comedian's trick. It just makes you seem funnier if you seem to be coming up with it. I remember the jokes, by the way. I said, this is literally the joke that got me the job. I said, oh, I know, you know what might be funny is like, you know those catchphrases that Clint Eastwood would do, you know, like, are you feeling lucky, punk? And go ahead, make my day. So what if you say, okay, Clint Eastwood's famous for those catchphrases, but what about the other catchphrases? The ones that for one reason or another never really caught on, like, say it, don't spray it, and eat lead, little girl. Eat lead, little girl is literally why I got this job that I wasn't qualified for, writing Liar Liar, because when it came time to do the rewrite, the studio said, Jim, who do you want to help you punch this up? He said, Judd Apatow. They said, Apatow's unavailable. He goes, what's that guy who wrote that joke about eat lead, little girl? Next thing I knew, in my shitty apartment on Crescent Heights in West Hollywood, fucking limo picks me up, takes me to the airport where a private jet is waiting, flown to New York. I have a suite in the Ritz. The Ritz is kind of a shitty hotel, by the way. It's called the Ritz, you think it's great, but it's like they had no voicemail, you know, and the elevators were terrible, but that's where we were, in the Ritz. So I spent 2 weeks in the Ritz with Jim Carrey punching up Liar Liar. My main experience from that, and it was a great and mysterious lesson, but one which I think still applies. Jim Carrey at that time, we spent 2 weeks in the Ritz in very close contact, because at that time he was so famous he could barely leave the building. If he walked out, he would be mobbed within a short period of time, and people would just say to him, Jim, you're so funny. Oh man, I love you, Jim. Can I have $100? And he would generally give it to them, because he came up from nothing, and that was still who he was, but it made him uncomfortable. So he preferred to stay in the Ritz and just perform for me manically for like 8 hours at a time. It was exhausting. Just by going like this, like sympathetically, like his head movements, I herniated a disc in my neck. That is with me today. The thing that was so remarkable about Jim Carrey at that point was the way he was constantly generating material, most of which no one has ever seen. He was constantly generating material with the idea that I'll use it somewhere. When I'm on a movie set, maybe this will apply somewhere. When I'm on a talk show, this will apply. And so it would be bits like this. He would say stuff like, he'd be like, Mark, he'd look you right in the eye. He'd go, Mark, you gotta avoid the chunks, baby. You gotta stay where it's chewy. Get away from the chunks. And then he would just kind of mime eating his way through chunky peanut butter, and then how much easier it was to eat your way through chewy, peanut buttery life. Never used anywhere, but it would just crush you, like, wow, this is incredible. He did a thing where he said, he goes, oh, I'm going to go on Letterman. How about this? And he just put 2 chairs together, and he goes, I'm going to tell him my acting style is real, baby. When I walk across the street, I really walk across the street. I don't have one of those machines that makes you look like you're walking. And he put 2 chairs together and just propped himself up, and his legs would kind of spindle like this. It's like there was some kind of machine that other actors used to make walk. It was so funny and never appeared anywhere. And he had a philosophy that justified this kind of behavior. He said, it's okay to just put stuff out in the universe. That was the way he put it, which I take to mean as a strategy for a creator like Jim Carrey. It's okay to just constantly be creating and not really think too much about where it's all going. I just thought it was remarkable. I mean, I had come from a much more critical tradition. If you think about what the Simpsons rewrite room was like, it was so cold and frightening and so quiet as you tried to think of perfect jokes and punchlines that wouldn't embarrass you. The opposite of that is Jim Carrey, which is a constant state of generation, and in fact is probably the superior way to create anything, is lower the bar, have more fun and play, and understand that through trial and error, which is a key principle of comedy, you're going to get more with more trial. In that sense, Jim Carrey was very influential to me. Another positive rewrite experience that I had was rewriting a feature film called Pet People, which was never made, but seemed to bump up pretty close. They attached a director at one point, they attached actors at one point. As you'll all find in your feature careers, this is a kind of success that is short of getting a feature made, but you've got to take your wins where you can get them because so few features really do get made. Pet People was a script with a simple premise. A dog and a cat that live in the same house turn into people. And they were kind of rivals, and they remain rivals somehow through the story, and comedy ensues. The script, when I received it, had already had 11 writers when I read it. And the writer before me was Marshall Brickman, who was Woody Allen's collaborator on Annie Hall, I believe. So they were hiring these big name writers, but the script was just terrible. It was useless. It was a premise that made no sense about some Indian amulet that a kid finds and wishes the dog and cat to become people. It was didn't make sense, and then it didn't have any set pieces of value. A dog turns into a human being, and the only set piece they had was that the dog goes to a hoedown. What is a hoedown? Even then, in whatever it was, 2000 or whatever, no one knew what a hoedown was anymore. The dog goes to a hoedown, and he seems to have supernatural powers of dancing at the hoedown. Like, how does that connect to being a dog? It doesn't make any sense. And so I essentially threw it all out. At that point, I was reaching a state of confidence that related to the fact that I had never spent any of the money that I had made. I had come out of college, established a college level of spending, and then through this entire career that I've told you about, I never increased my spending. I had a shitty car, and I lived in a shitty apartment that I had bought. And so basically my savings were increasing to the point where when I came in to do a feature rewrite, I didn't have any fear about going, so I'm just going to throw all this out for you guys and create something new and good. And that's what I did on Pet People. Here are the things that I did. One was the premise at the core of it, I think, really improved. Basically, I had cat and dog pulling on a wishbone and snapping it during a speech that the mom and the kid are having in the house about, do you think animals wish they were like us? Oh, I bet they're wishing it all the time. As the dog and cat are fighting over a scrap of food and they break a wishbone and they turn into people. That kind of elegant way in. But the thing that really made this a successful rewrite was somehow I managed to pour myself into the story and the character of the dog on a very personal level. Now, keep in mind, at this point I was writing it ostensibly for Mike Myers, who was attached. So this was going to be a big, goofy, balls-out comedy, right? Where my dog's going to turn to Mike Myers. He's definitely going to be drinking out of a toilet at some point, right? I mean, it's going to be that kind of comedy. But in my mind, I managed to frame it as a story about whether it is okay to be a human being. The dog becomes a human being. What is it to be a human being? At first, it's wonderful if you're a dog. You can walk around, you can open the fridge, you can eat all the food, you can get on a bus, there's all kinds of great stuff. It's incredible. The movie had no songs in it before I got my hands on it. I added a song where the dog's walking around going, it's good to be a human being. So I took a lot of authority over it and really believed in what I was doing, even in a kind of goofy way. And then the dog has kind of an existential crisis as he goes through heartbreak and loss and kind of realizes that the kid's parents are getting divorced, and he kind of sees, oh man, life is so much harder than I realized. And then it's hard to be a human. He staggers around tearfully singing this, right? And a dog comforts him in his lowest moment, right? And I wrote this, I had isolated myself in an apartment in Manhattan where I thought I would be able to work better. And I wrote this for a few weeks, and I remember it clearly going into a coffee shop and doing a little pass with pencils, rewriting the dialogue, and tears flowing down my face. And I thought, oh, fuck, am I losing my mind? This is a fucking Mike Myers movie. I'm drinking out of a toilet, and I'm weeping, right? But I turned it in, and here is the interesting lesson. It was a very effective rewrite. It instantly garnered a director. Cast was interested, and it was produced by DreamWorks. and I got a message saying Steven Spielberg wants to meet you on the basis of this crazy broad comedy. And sure enough, I went to DreamWorks. I sat there having some other unrelated meeting, and then I hear from outside, "Is he there? Where is he?" So yeah, and in comes Steven Spielberg, and he says, "I read your script. It was very humane." I think it's the highest praise you can get, and relates to that, right? Really caring at some level, even about something ridiculous. If you can relate, it seems to have that effect on the reader. So there's a story of success. All right, let's conclude here with two stories of, you decide, is this catastrophe? These are the two most famous stories in the Brent Forrester Pantheon. Enjoy. The first one, people who know me, I'll go to a feature punch-up sometimes, and they'll go around and say your name. I've got so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. I'll say Brent Forrester, and someone in the back will go, "Katzenberg!" What does that mean? This is what it means. Most famous story about me. At one point, in my mid-30s, I got a call from Ben Stiller who said he was in a movie called Madagascar. And they had a version of the movie to a show, but he was concerned. He thought that maybe it wasn't as good as they were telling him, and he wanted outside perspective. Would I come and watch Madagascar and just give him, some feedback? So I said, of course, right? So I go to DreamWorks, and we sit in a theater like this. We watch this cut of Madagascar. Some of it is still black and white. It's a work in progress, and it has a lot of problems. Some of it is just disturbing, but their whole scenes, they're really awful. Like it's just hallucinatory. It makes you feel terrible that a kid would have to watch this. But there's also just terrible, cruddy writing where they have Chris Rock and Ben Stiller in long scenes, and there's no attempt at comedy. They're just kind of going, "What time is it? I don't know. Where are you going for lunch? I'm not even hungry." It's just phoned-in dialogue. And I'm writing notes on a pad in the dark, and I get like 20 pages of notes, done before the movie's over. And then I figure we'll just go and, sit in a room or something and give Ben feedback. And so I leave the theater, and I'm walking out, and I notice like a lot of the people who were in the audience are walking with me, and we're all going to a conference room. And I'm like, my God, there's some pretty big writers here. That's Steve Levitan, who ends up creating Modern Family, already a giant writer at the time. There's John Hamburg, who did something about Mary. I mean, almost everybody around me is just a fucking giant comedy writer. It's astonishing. And we go into a conference room. It's the biggest conference room I've ever seen. It was like a meeting room that you just kind of supersized. Probably 40 writers around the table. And then every inch of the wall space is taken by writers too, standing with their backs to the wall. This is just a colossal waste of human talent. I mean, if you have ever tried to have a discussion about anything with more than 5 people, it can't really be done effectively. You should not have more than 5 people giving you feedback. It's not possible. We have 80, 100. And there is Katzenberg sitting here. And I'm here with my back to the wall, right? Looking at the table, and then Katzenberg. And Katzenberg, who's a wonderful guy, by the way. There's nothing wrong with Katzenberg, but this was not a good use of people's time. Katzenberg turns to the left and asks the first writer, "Okay, so we saw this movie. Just tell us what you think. I don't care. Just whatever I want to hear what you think." First guy says, "Well, first of all, it's phenomenal achievement in filming. Just thought the lion character was incredible. I think we should call it back." And it just goes. It takes about 7 minutes to just completely blow smoke up Katzenberg's ass. And then the next person talks. "Well, I thought it was remarkable, and it's such a great effort, and it's incredible. And I think that you can have a twist and blah." And I'm like, oh my God, it's going to take us like 9 hours to get to me, and nobody's saying anything honest about this thing that needs a ton of work, right? And again, for some reason at this time, I didn't have a real heavy feeling of a healthy fear for my reputation, I think. And so this is what I did. I thought, fuck, I can't wait forever here. I'm just going to step off. After the second guy talks, he finishes. And so I just stepped off the wall into this room, and I said, "Katzenberg!" And everyone turned, right? And it was so tense. People were, think how, if you're going to kiss ass like that, this is a tense room, and it's all eyes on me. I remember Hamburg looking at me, I remember Ben Stiller looking at me, and I said, "Listen, it doesn't appear that anybody's going to tell you the truth about this movie because everybody wants to work at DreamWorks in the future. I can relate, but I was brought here to give you honest feedback, and I got to tell you, here's the problems with your movie. And I just riled through a bunch of them, including you got whole scenes here where Ben Stiller and Chris Rock are talking, two funniest guys on the planet right now. Nobody's written them any jokes. You got a bunch of writers in here. Why don't you pay one of them to write you some punchlines? And as I got myself worked up to that level, and then I realized I don't really have an exit from this. I can't just step back to the wall. So I thought, I gotta have an exit line, so I just said, and with that, adios, amigos! As if it was the line I always used. And actually, a big meeting, and I just throw it out of there. And within like days, it had become the most famous and falsely retold story. I was at UTA like a week later, and somebody said, I heard about you throwing that pie at what? And it continues to be legendary. Like at Super Fun Night, all the actors had heard the story and they admired it. I don't think of it as a shining example of professional behavior, but I think that the actors really like it because it sounds like this courageous standing up for principle against power and authority, perhaps. All right, final tale. This one, I think you'll find this interesting, but again, I can't say that I would use this as an example of how to behave. There came a period for me in my career where I had done TV shows that had feature rewrites. I did not have overt financial pressure because I had saved my money and hadn't expanded my expenses. And I really wanted to see what I could do as a writer if nobody was telling me what to do. And so I decided to take the best idea that I'd ever had for a movie and just write it and let it dictate the way it should go. I'll pitch it to people, and from their feedback, I'll write it. I'll show it to people, and from their interest, I'll let it go the way it wants to go with no feedback. Well, the premise was a guy goes into a thrift store, and he's looking around at interesting stuff, and he finds a high school yearbook. And in it, he sees their signatures, and they're all to some girl who's about his age from a high school he didn't go to. And he buys the yearbook and he gets interested in it, and he kind of puts together a whole story of who she was and who her friends were, and then goes to that town. That's all I really had. I just thought that was interesting, But as I began to write it, it actually unfolded as a very dark story. It ended up as a murder mystery in which the character who goes there begins to believe that he is the murderer, and then there's a twist. It turns out he isn't, but he has been there before. It was just enormously complicated and dark and difficult to write. Incredibly difficult. I'd never tried to write a mystery and quickly discovered you cannot succeed in a mystery unless you have an ending that is a surprise and works. And I just had never really tried doing that. So I was way over my head in terms of the difficulty, and also I was writing in a genre that my agents probably could not easily sell because my whole history was comedy and here was a mystery. What happened was I was at UTA and I found that UTA wasn't interested much in this spec that I was working on, and it bothered me. There was an agent here who left and went and founded Endeavor. John Lesher was his name. He became a partner at Endeavor. He was my feature agent. He said, "Come with me to Endeavor." And I said, "John, will you help me stretch as an artist because I'm trying to do what I've never done before?" He said, "Of course I will." Okay, so I went with him. Not true. He palmed me off on his assistant, a nice young woman named Dawn Saltzman, but a woman who didn't really have a lot of experience promoting people who didn't really know who I was. And my career just chilled out. I mean, I was there at Endeavor for 1 year, and it was a palpable feeling of the death of a feature rewrite career. Because at the end of a year with Endeavor, I'd gotten married, my wife was pregnant, and I suddenly thought, you know what, fuck it, I'm tired of being an artist. I need to be a breadwinner again, and couldn't get feature rewrite jobs. And it bothered me, disturbed me, concerned me. I couldn't get any feedback from Endeavor that felt right. I started to feel like I need to leave this agency. This is one of those moments where I'm frustrated and worried, and I need to talk to Endeavor and have a meeting with them and figure this out. Endeavor gets it. They realize that I'm worried and might leave. They schedule a meeting. I talk to a friend of mine before the meeting. That friend is Paul Lieberstein, who played Toby on The Office. You can picture that guy. He's a very good writer and performer and very smart about business. And I talked to him the day before this meeting, and I said, "Paul, I need your advice, man, because I'm having these weird thoughts that I want to go to this meeting endeavor, and I want to go there wearing a wig, and doing an accent, an English accent. And I want to claim that I am not Brent Forrester, but I'm Alex Norton. I'm a manager that represents Brent Forrester. I go, well, do you relate to this at all, Paul? As an artist, what's going on, man? Am I losing my mind? He goes, no, you're right. I said, why? I don't trust you. He says, because, Brent, this is one of those meetings where they just, completely convince you that you should stay when you shouldn't, and then they're really good at that, and then you're gonna sweep it all under the rug, and you're gonna stay there when you don't want to be there. But if you do this, they're gonna get the message that something serious is going on, and they will remember this. And I go, okay, Paul. I have a terrible night's sleep. I wake up in the morning, I call Paul again, I go, Paul, the meeting's in 45 minutes, and I didn't sleep well, and I don't know if I can do this, and if you tell me to do it, I'll do it, but if you say I can get out of this, I'll get out of it. He goes, you have to do it. But, trust me, Brent, once you start this, you must not break character. Because if you break character, it will ruin everything you're trying to do, and will be worse than you've never done it at all. And I was like, I understand, Paul, I understand. Why did I trust Paul? I mean, why was he doing this? I think he was genuine, too. Went to Endeavor wearing the wig. Now, keep in mind, the wig belonged to my wife, short black wig with the red sideburns poking out. There was no question that this was anybody but me. It was me in a wig. I showed up to the front desk, and I said, hello, I'm here for the Brent Forrester meeting. And they said, what's your name? Alex Norton. And I said, okay. And then they kind of announced me, and I sort of sat in a little, lobby waiting room. And then they sent an assistant out. Like, who the fuck is Alex Norton, right? And then the assistant looks at me and then reports back as Brent Forrester in a wig. Right? And first to come out was one of the comedy agents. There were going to be 4 agents in this meeting. And the first one that came out was a comedy agent, and who I knew just a little bit, and she assumed that this was a comedy bit that I was doing. I said, hello, I'm here for the Brent Forrester meeting. She was, oh, hello. And it was awful for me, because there was no comic energy in me. There was only hostility, really, in this weird stuff. And Paula told me I couldn't break character, so I couldn't explain this to her. And so it just felt like I'm doing something that isn't funny, that you think is supposed to be. And just the discomfort was immediate. We begin the meeting. 4 of us there. John Lesher, partner in the agency, a guy named Richard White's a great TV agent, Don Saltzman, the assistant that had become an agent, and they're all sitting there, and I'm speaking in an English accent, and John Lesher pretty quickly loses patience with this when he sees that I'm not going to drop the accent, and he says, maybe I should come back when Brent Forrester is here. And I say, do you have somewhere to go? I thought we were having a meeting about Brent Forrester's career. Well, let's have a meeting then. Shouldn't we have a meeting? And so it must have been just bizarre to them. Like, what has happened to this guy? In addition, I had brought the spec script that I was working on, a mystery. And at this time, I had titled it The Final Thought. That was the name of the script. And I had illustrated just a little line drawing of a key scene in the script where a car is going off a cliff. And so I'm walking around with this thing. Do you know what this is? Oh, yeah, I do. Take a look, why don't you? Right? And they're like, this is a fucking suicide note in screenplay form. I had convinced myself that I was doing something that had tremendous artistic integrity. I felt like it's not for me to promote this script. I'm not going to tell you, the reader, that this is interesting. I happen to believe it's interesting. I think it's fascinating. I think it's a brilliant work of writing. But I can't tell you that. That violates my artistic principle. However, if I am interesting and fascinating, a fellow walking around with a wig on, right, doing an English accent, maybe you'll become interested in it for that reason. That was literally my thought process. None of that was communicated. They just thought I'd lost my mind. Poor Dawn Saltzman, a wonderful young woman, but at one point she looked me in the eyes and she said, come back to us, Brent. And I remember turning my back thinking, this is really funny and weird. And 30 minutes of this. I kept looking at my watch and, Jesus, Paul, fuck, why didn't you let me allow, to break character? 30 minutes went by, and then suddenly, John Lesher was on his feet, very angry, and he said, you know what, Brent, have a nice life. And he just walked out. And so he had perceived whatever subconscious hostility I was feeling, anger at them that I couldn't express, and came out in this odd stunt. He got it and left the room, and I suddenly felt this tremendous relief because, in fact, I had wanted to leave Endeavor, but didn't know how, and so I suddenly had the relief of like, well, I can't stay here when the partner just told me to have a nice life, so it's obvious we're going to break up our partnership and I'm free to go back to UTA, which is what I did. But, punchline to the story, when John Lesher walked out, 30 minutes had gone by, I was like, fuck Paul Lieberstein, I can't do this anymore, and so I took off the wig and just became myself again, and then I turned to the other agents in the room and pointed at John Lesher and I said, God, what is his problem? Which they totally accepted, like, yeah, and they apologized for him. He just, he hasn't got enough sleep, he just flew on a plane. Like, it's unreasonable for him to walk out. The guy is pitching a fucking mental fit. Thank you, that's Brent Forrester, TV story.